Hello again, I am Blunty. Now, there has been much rumbling and grousing around Starfield's console-based existence being locked down to a very last generation 30 FPS. Todd Howard, head bloke at Bethesda and a man with a casual relationship with honesty, has gone on record as claiming that this is a deliberate choice that he made for graphical fidelity, chosen over, player choice, where many games these days have two modes on consoles, performance and resolution or whatever, and the developers leave the player to make the choice if they would prefer a little more visual detail at the cost of being jammed up at 30 FPS, or if they'd like to sacrifice some fidelity or resolution for a smoother, more fluid-feeling gaming experience. That is the correct choice, in case you were wondering. But is this just more classic Todd Howard smoke and mirrors? Is it BS, basically? Could we be getting a much better console experience at or soon after launch? Seems like it might very well be possible that frame rates could double on console all the way to 60 FPS using this one small trick. That way, Todd can come out and claim to have listened to players or pretend that his dev team did some last-minute miracles. Maybe. In more practical terms, and if I wasn't so burned out by Todd's reputation as a shit-kicker, I might be generous and say, well, he's under-promising now so he can over-deliver later, which is always a nice PR spin move. And the reason he can't make any promises at pre-release about a better console experience in particular is because, well, he's not in control of the technology that is needed to make that happen and when that technology is ready. So he wasn't sure it was going to be there at launch, so he couldn't promise that Starfield would be 60 FPS on console. Maybe he's actually trying to avoid being called a liar this time, as rumours are indeed buzzing in the last few days, in particular that FSR 3.0 is indeed ready to go and Starfield will be the flagship product to show it off. We already know AMD and Bethesda have a co-marketing arrangement already, so it all lines up, and if you can believe Todd, Starfield already is capable of running at more than 30 FPS, up to 60 FPS a lot of the time, in his words he claimed. So we don't necessarily even need FSR 3.0 to double frame rates. It might be that a 25 to 40% uplift is all we really need to give console players a 60 FPS feeling experience. Now then, for those of you who mainline console as your gaming rig of choice, you might be wondering what the heck FSR even is and what AMD has to do with it. So, for those people, let's do some quick context. FSR stands for Fidelity FX Super Resolution. It is an AMD graphical technology. If you've seen Nvidia's marketing around DLSS, maybe most recently with the Cyberpunk stuff, it's a bit like that. Except it's open source. It works on AMD, it works on Nvidia and Intel GPUs just fine. It's not tied to a particular hardware generation architecture the way DLSS 3.0 is either. It encapsulates a few different technologies for enhancing and boosting graphical performance of games. In basic terms, FSR renders the game at a lower resolution than will be displayed to the end user, which is less taxing on the graphical hardware, obviously. But then, before it shows you the frame, it uses some fancy graphical upscaling algorithms to artificially increase their resolution. It's along similar lines to what Sony do with their checkerboarding stuff. You might have heard that if you're a console player. It's a smarter version of that, basically. It fakes high resolutions. And FSR 2.0 works so effectively, I was able to use it to save enough performance overhead to run Cyberpunk 2077 with full ray tracing at playable frame rates on the ROG Ally handheld gaming PC. Without FSR turned on, that's a single-digit frame rate experience. That was a pretty extreme case, and I did have to use every last ounce of capability FSR had to do that, and it wasn't particularly the way I want to play the game, but as evidence of what FSR is capable of doing at its most extreme, it's a pretty effective demonstration. But FSR 3.0 is also bringing a new way to boost perceived performance: frame interpolation. As you may imagine by the name, this tech does more than just fake some resolution. It is responsible for making entirely fake frames to insert in between the real rendered frames to present the game as if it were running at a higher frame rate. Nvidia already have a similar trick in DLSS 3.0. They call it frame generation. But the problem with that is it only works on their very latest generation of RTX 4000 series GPUs because they've tied it into specific hardware architecture that only exists on those specific graphics cards. It doesn't even work on any of the other NVIDIA graphics cards. While AMD's solution should work on a bunch of existing hardware, old and new. Because AMD's solution is open source and not tied to specific hardware requirements. And because FSR 3.0 can be expected to maintain this backwards compatible philosophy, we can absolutely expect it to work on the AMD RDNA 2 based GPU architecture that lives inside the Xbox Series X and S. Earlier this year, at GDC, AMD showcased a demo where an Unreal Engine 5 game saw its frame rate leap from 60 FPS using FSR 2.0 all the way up to 120 FPS with FSR 3.0 when outputting a 4K image. And let's just be clear here for those of you thinking, well, I've already seen this, my TV does this. No, it doesn't. This is far more than the basic bitch motion smoothing stuff you might see on some TVs that makes everything look awful and is designed for watching sports or some crap, but anyone with half a clue turns it off because it is really, really terrible and absolutely unusable for gaming because of the latency it introduces. Now, what's happening here is something AMD called AMD Fluid Motion, which uses motion vectors, that's information from the actively rendering frames, to figure out what is moving, how far it's moving, which direction, and how fast, all in the hopes of, hopefully, accurately generating a frame that can slide between the other frames visually invisibly. Whereas the stuff that happens on your motion smoothing TV is way, 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 way dumber than that. The goal with all this is not to be perfect, the goal is to be fast enough and good enough at the same time for any artifacting to go unnoticed in normal gameplay, so you can get the feel of a higher frame rate responsiveness in your game on hardware that would otherwise not be able to brute force that many frames out. But the issue is, of course, latency. It takes time to do the math and generate whole entire fake frames to squeeze in between the real ones. And this latency issue is believed to be why FSR 3.0 has had a delay already. It was expected to be out by now, a few months back as a matter of fact, but it was pushed back. The scuttlebutt has it that the core reason behind the delay was to give the engineers at AMD more time to really hone in on tightening up the latency issues to deliver a more responsive feeling gameplay. Now, you're always going to have some extra latency with a system like this. It's just the nature of the beast. Again, it takes time to do the math. And in some games, that will be a deal breaker, absolutely. But in a game like Starfield, with this style of gameplay, it's not hard to imagine that the largest amount of players, especially console players, will never even notice a little bit extra latency. And if the rumors are to be believed, and frankly I see no reason to suspect they aren't, the new rumbling lines up exactly with older rumors about the new timing of the FSR 3.0 release being September. Which all means we may very well see it in Starfield at launch. I wonder if it'll be there in the early access. Perhaps we'll get it in a day one patch on, quote-unquote real release day. Perhaps soon after launch in a follow-up patch. Whatever the case, FSR 3.0 is coming, and it's bringing frame interpolation with it, and AMD are of course working directly with Bethesda on Starfield marketing, so all the stars seem aligned for Starfield to be the flagship product to really show off FSR 3.0, show off the new upscaling, show off the new frame interpolation, show off everything it can do, and with all this we may very well have the magic bullet to make Starfield's console experience a lot more pleasant for those of us whom first-person games with console-level field of view and 30 FPS is a recipe for feeling literally sick. And if you're gonna argue with me on that, I invite you to watch the other recent video I made about console 30 FPS and Starfield. It's right there, you can click it. Outside of the console experience, this also gives me a little more hope that my experience on the ROG Ally with Starfield, playing Starfield in handheld mode, might be even more within reach. Thanks for watching, I am Blunty. Thank you as always to the patrons scrolling up above there, whose above me on support is wondrous. Catch you next time.